Okay, it's time to look at Unit 3 of the AP World Timeline, Greece and Rome. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milks, let's get to it. Alright, let's begin with ancient Greece. And to do that, we're going to look at these two terms. First, polis, which is just a fancy word for city-state. And second, the Mediterranean Sea, which was very important because, well, you can see Greece is surrounded by it, and many of their city-states were on the coast. Now, you might think city-states would be isolated and independent from one another, but that wasn't really the case. They had enough in common culturally, and they traded with one another enough that there was sort of like a Mediterranean identity. You could also call this region the Aegean world to distinguish it from later classical Rome. But either way, this map shows how Greece was divided into many small independent states, each with its own government, laws, and even currency. Now, if you've seen my other videos, or if you know somebody who has done the AP World program before, then you probably already know all about the big ones here, Athens and Sparta. But there are some other interesting ones too. Corinth was a wealthy trading city that was not super friendly with Athens. Thebes briefly dominated Greece after defeating Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra. And Miletus, well, that's where the philosopher Thales came from. And if you know anything about Greek philosophy, you probably know he's considered the first one. He is also notable because he was the first person to try to explain natural phenomena without appealing to the gods. For instance, he said lightning was caused by a buildup of vapors on the earth, not by Zeus hurling thunderbolts. Speaking of philosophers, let's go ahead and talk about how Greece gave birth to philosophy, which is kind of a big deal. In general, the Greeks valued knowledge and reason, and this led to the foundation of philosophical schools of thought. So let's go ahead and name drop some big ones. Socrates, who famously asked questions to make other people think, but he wrote nothing down. So we know about him through his students. One of his students was Plato, who started the Academy, one of the first higher learning institutions in Europe. He wrote extensively about philosophy and politics, including this dialogue called the Republic. And one of Plato's students was Aristotle, who started his own school called the Lyceum. He was a logician, a scientist, a philosopher, kind of a Renaissance man. And the Golden Age of Athens, which occurred during the 5th century BCE, was the high point of classical Greece. It was during this time period that Pericles came to power, and Athens became the center of a maritime empire that stretched throughout the Mediterranean. And while Athens was busy being an amazing place, it got into 2 wars with the Persians, and we call this the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persians had been trying to subjugate the Greek city-states along the coast of modern Turkey, and the Greeks were like, hey, that's our buddies, and that's totally not cool. And so, they went to war. And it was epic. Marathon, Salamis, Plataea, those names still ring with glory. And Athens emerged victorious, and the historian Herodotus wrote a history of the Greco-Persian Wars. And because he did, we call this period the Age of Historians. Also, Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, and that was a war between Athens and Sparta that broke out after Athens got too boss and everybody got tired of it. And Sparta was like, you know what, we're going to put a stop to that. And with the help of Persia, they did. And in the end, both sides were exhausted and unable to continue. So they made up and hired an outsider, a guy named Philip of Macedon, to come defeat the Persians. And his son Alexander the Great actually did it. And that led to the Hellenistic period. So remember when I said the Greeks had a Mediterranean identity? Well, Alexander spread that identity much farther. His empire stretched from Greece all the way to India, and cities like Alexandria in Egypt and Antioch in Syria became centers of learning and trade. The Greek language and culture blended with those of the East, and that cultural fusion lasted a long time, but politically, it was a bit unstable. After Alexander died, his empire broke into several pieces, and one of those pieces was the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, ruled over by, you guessed it, and they liked to promote themselves as pharaohs, and Cleopatra was the last active ruler of this line. And she famously had a love affair with Julius Caesar and then with Mark Antony, both of whom she wound up getting pregnant by. But Rome was not a fan of her shenanigans, and they deposed her. Egypt became a province of Rome. And now it's time to look at Rome. So let's begin with the Roman Republic. And there are 3 big terms we need to define. First, we have the patricians, which were the landowning aristocrats of Rome. Then we have the plebeians, which were the common folk, the merchants, artisans, traders, farmers, that sort of thing. And finally, there were the slaves. And these 3 groups formed the social hierarchy of Rome. At the top were the patricians, then the plebeians, and at the bottom were the slaves. And Rome was ruled by a representative government with 2 elected officials called consuls. They were the chief executives of Rome, but they only served 1-year terms. And that was designed to prevent anybody from becoming too powerful. Instead, power was concentrated in the Senate, which was a body of elder statesmen who had previously held political office. And in the early years of the Republic, there was tension between the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians wanted all the power and the plebeians were like, We want some representation, please. And eventually, they got it. Plea. That was the name of the group that represented the common people. They pushed for more rights and representation and eventually got it. But the most lasting contribution of the early republic was Roman law. It was codified in 12 tables and posted in the forum for all to see. Some of the principles of Roman law included the idea that all citizens were subject to the same laws and that a person was considered innocent until proven guilty. The next period was the Roman Empire, which began in 27 BCE with the reign of Augustus. But before we get to that, let me tell you about the big man himself, Julius Caesar. He seized power in a civil war and was assassinated by a group of senators who feared he was becoming too powerful. Augustus, who was Caesar's grandnephew, defeated Mark Antony, Cleopatra, and their combined armies at the Battle of Actium, and that secured his rule as the first emperor of Rome. The Pax Romana was a 200-year period of peace and prosperity throughout the empire, and it began during the reign of Augustus and ended with the death of Marcus Aurelius. During this time, Rome was at its greatest territorial extent, and the Mediterranean was a Roman lake. There were provinces throughout the empire, and they varied in their degree of Romanization. Some places like Judea were more independent, and others like Egypt were completely run by a prefect. But Rome was a highly urbanized society, and if you wanted to get around, especially in the provinces, you could take advantage of the extensive road system that the Romans built. In addition, Rome built aqueducts to bring fresh water into the city. And without clean water, you cannot have a sanitary sewer system. And without a sanitary sewer system, you cannot have public baths. And without public baths, your society will fall apart. So aqueducts and public baths were super important. Rome was a polytheistic religion with mystery cults, so people could worship whatever they wanted as long as it didn't interfere with the imperial cult. That was a religion in which the emperor was divine. In the late empire, there were some serious problems: military invasions, economic instability, political corruption, and the list goes on. And ultimately, Rome split into two halves, East and West. And in 476 CE, the Western Roman Empire fell. The Germanic people invaded and deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the West. And that date is often cited as the traditional date for the fall of Rome. Okay? Click right over here to grab a review packet if you need help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And additionally, I have developed a Heimer test that is guaranteed to find you the best test prep materials on the market. It's a totally free resource and you can find it at the website provided. I am glad we got to hang out for a few minutes. And I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Signing out.